Imagine, for just a second, that you are a university student, right? And you are preparing for literally the most important final exam of your entire life.
Right. The one that makes or breaks everything.
Exactly. Your entire career depends on it. So you sit down in front of your professor, and you just completely blank.
Just total panic.
Total panic.
Mm-hmm.
And when you are asked for an excuse, you look at your professor and you say, I am so sorry. I accidentally looked at a crucified man on my way to class, and it completely ruined my memory.
I mean, it sounds like an absurd piece of dark comedy, doesn't it?
It really does. It's wild.
But the thing is, as we'll see today, in the historical context we're examining, that was considered completely legitimate, like officially documented advice for students on what to avoid while studying.
Which is just incredible. You know, if you're listening to this and you're like most people today, you probably have something like 20 tabs open on your browser right now.
At least 20.
Right. You're listening to this deep dive. Maybe you're skimming an article on the side. You're checking the feed, texting a friend. We live in this absolute ocean of information. And honestly, it can feel completely overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely.
It's this endless, fragmented barrage of data, and we are just constantly treading water, you know?
Yeah.
Just trying to keep our heads above the surface.
Yeah, we totally treat knowledge as a commodity now. It's data to be mined, processed, and utilized, usually for, professional advancement, just getting ahead.
Right, getting the degree to get the job.
Exactly. But today, we are taking a deep dive into a profoundly different worldview. We're looking at the historical Islamic educational system.
And we're focusing on a specific era, right?
Yeah, specifically during the Middle Periods, which spans roughly from the year 1000 to 1800 CE.
Okay, so our mission here for you listening is to unpack this vast stack of historical sources. We want to understand a single central concept, which is ilm.
Ilm.
The Arabic word that gets broadly translated as knowledge. We really want to understand how an immense, global, person-to-person network of learning literally held an entire world together.
And we're talking about a world spanning from West Africa all the way to Southeast Asia.
Centuries before the concept of the internet even existed.
Yeah, and setting the tone for this exploration is crucial right up front, because this isn't merely a history of schools or, old syllabuses or medieval architecture.
Though we will get into some amazing architecture.
We definitely will. But at its core, this is about how the pursuit of knowledge literally forged the soul of a civilization. The scholar Franz Rosenthal, whose work features really prominently in our sources today, he actually points out that translating ilm simply as knowledge is a massive disservice.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, the English word just fails to capture both the factual and the deep, deep emotional weight of the concept. Ilm was the driving force that gave Muslim civilization its distinctive complexion.
So it's bigger than just knowing things.
Much bigger. Rosenthal actually argues that ilm essentially is Islam. It touched, defined, and regulated every single aspect of a person's life.
And when the sources say every aspect, they really mean every aspect, because the pursuit of learning wasn't just a recommendation or like a fun hobby for the rich elite.
No, not at all.
It was a fundamental requirement for all Muslims, male and female, literally from the cradle to the grave. The sources quote, that famous tradition to seek knowledge, even if it be in China.
And you have to understand the theological stakes involved here, because the cultural obsession was absolute. This wasn't about getting a good job, Yeah. This was about the eternal fate of your soul.
Right, the stakes are literally heaven and hell.
Exactly. Without knowledge, the underlying belief was that there could be no salvation. Every single believer, regardless of their social standing, needed enough knowledge to conduct their daily occupations lawfully in sight of God.
So it wasn't just for the scholars.
No. If you were a merchant, you had to know the specific commercial laws. If you were a farmer, you needed to understand the legalities of land use and crop taxation. Ignorance was not a valid excuse.
It was a spiritual failing.
Precisely.
There is an anecdote in the text that perfectly captures how deep this obsession went, and it goes to an almost surreal degree. It's about a scholar named Muhammad ibn al-Hassan from the 8th century.
Ah, yes. This is a fascinating one.
Right. So according to the story, after he died, he appeared to a fellow believer in a dream. And when he was asked about his transition to the afterlife, he admitted that he had been so completely, intensely absorbed in thinking about the complex legalities of freeing slaves that he didn't even notice the moment he had passed away.
He was literally too busy thinking to notice he died.
Exactly. He studied right through his own death.
It's a striking story, and honestly, whether it's literal truth or just a cultural fable, It reveals the staggering reverence this society had for the scholarly mind. In this world, the scholar wasn't just an academic sitting in some ivory tower.
What were they seen as then?
They were the guardians of the divine will. I mean, there was a highly popular tradition explicitly stating that the ink of the scholar is superior to the blood of the martyr.
Okay, I want to pause on that for a second, because if you really think about it, the weight of that statement is massive.
It really is.
Like, in a deeply religious society where martyrdom is often viewed as the ultimate sacrifice, the highest possible honor you can achieve, to say that the ink on a scholar's page is superior to a martyr's blood, that completely reorders the entire social hierarchy.
It entirely reorders it. Scholars were frequently referred to as the heirs to the prophets because, the era of prophecy had officially ended with Muhammad, so the scholars were the ones left to interpret the revelation and guide the community.
That's a huge burden.
Yeah. There was even another tradition that circulated saying, kings are the rulers of people, but scholars are the rulers of kings.
But logistically, how did that reverence actually play out in the classroom? If you are a student, how do you even treat the heir to the prophets?
Very, very carefully.
Right. The sources note that you didn't just casually walk into a room and take a seat. Students were explicitly taught to venerate their teachers like fathers.
And the etiquette was incredibly strict.
Yeah, you couldn't walk in front of your teacher, you couldn't speak without explicit permission, and you never, ever asked a question when the teacher looked tired or annoyed.
You had to read the room perfectly.
Exactly. It sounds like an atmosphere of intense, almost suffocating deference. Which kind of makes me wonder, with all this hero worship, all this talk of their ink being holier than blood, didn't these scholars let it go to their heads?
Oh, of course they did.
I mean, it sounds like they were treated like medieval A-list celebrities.
They essentially were. And human nature being what it is, the ego absolutely became a profound problem. The idealized vision was that a scholar should shun luxury, avoid the corrupting influence of political power, and practice rigorous humility.
But that didn't always happen.
Rarely happened with the elite. The historical texts are actually full of biting criticism against those who failed to stay humble. The great philosopher and theologian Al-Ghazali was famously fiercely critical of his own peer.
What did he say about them?
He lambasted the hypocrites who sold out to the government for stipends and status. He actually called them prattling wearers of flowing robes. He accused them of obsessing over obscure legal minutiae just to show off in debates while completely losing the true spiritual heart of their faith.
Ah, the flowing robes. That actually brings us to my favorite detail in this first section of the deep dive.
The fashion crisis.
Yes. In Mamluk Egypt, which was this very wealthy cosmopolitan society, the religious scholars, the ulama, became incredibly obsessed with their status symbols, specifically their clothing.
All right, they really leaned into the celebrity aspect.
They started wearing these outrageously giant, outsized turbans and massive sleeves just to broadcast their scholarly weight to everyone on the street.
The bigger the turban, the bigger the brain.
Exactly. And the best part is that the common people did not let them get away with it at all. Street players in Cairo put on these satirical plays.
Like a medieval sketch comedy show.
Yes. There was one called The Manner of the Judge, and these actors would literally run around the streets in comically massive turbans, mercilessly lampooning the vanity of the scholars. It's honestly so comforting to know that even centuries ago, the public loved roasting out-of-touch celebrities.
It's a universal human trait, and it is a wonderful reminder that while the position of the scholar was venerated, the flawed individuals who occupied those positions were subject to very sharp public scrutiny.
So if you are one of these scholars, giant turban or not, what exactly are you dedicating your life to studying? Like, what is the actual curriculum that justifies all this intense reverence?
Well, the sources outline a very specific intellectual architecture. During these middle periods, knowledge was broadly categorized into two major, often competing spheres, and those were supported by a third foundational sphere.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first one?
The first, and definitely the most prestigious, was the traditional sciences, known as Nakliya. These were the subjects derived directly from divine revelation.
So this is basically the core religious texts.
Exactly. You have the Quran itself, the Hadith, which are the compiled sayings and actions of the Prophet. You have jurisprudence, or fiqh, which is Islamic law. But it also included kalam, which is speculative theology, and Sufism, the mystical, esoteric dimension of the faith.
Okay, I want to make sure we define kalam, speculative theology, because that sounds really intense. What does that actually mean in practice for a student?
Kalam essentially means speech or discourse. But in practice, it was the discipline of defending theological principles through dialectic debate.
So arguing over theology.
Yes, but highly structured arguing. It dealt with incredibly dense questions. For example, if the Quran mentions the hand of God, is that a literal physical hand? Because if so, that implies God has a human-like body. Or is it purely metaphorical for God's power?
Oh, I see. That gets complicated fast.
Very fast. So Kalam scholars used rigorous logical argumentation to defend the orthodox position against what they saw as heretical interpretations.
Got it. So that's the traditional sphere. What is the second sphere?
The second was the rational sciences, or akliya. Now, these were fields derived entirely from human reason, perception, and observation. And crucially, these sciences were heavily derived from ancient Greek texts that had been translated into Arabic in the earlier centuries.
So we're talking about Aristotle, Plato.
Exactly. This sphere included logic, metaphysics, mathematics, which, by the way, encompassed geometry, astronomy, and even music, and physics, which surprisingly included medicine and agriculture.
Wait, hold on. Music and agriculture were grouped together under the rational sciences.
Yeah, because they were both understood through empirical observation and mathematical proportion rather than divine revelation.
That is so interesting. Okay, so we had the traditional and the rational.
Yeah.
And supporting both of these massive spheres was the third field, which is adab.
Adab, yes, which our sources translate roughly as humanism or the literary arts.
This is like the toolkit you needed before you could even dive into the heavy theology or the Greek logic, right? We're talking grammar, poetry, eloquence, oratory, letter writing.
Correct. And within adab, grammar was considered the most vital instrument. I mean, you couldn't possibly interpret the complexities of the Quran or the Hadith if you didn't have total mastery over the mechanics of the Arabic language.
That makes total sense.
But while grammar was the essential tool, poetry was considered the premier art form.
The emphasis on eloquence in the sources is honestly fascinating. And it is mainly because of why they valued it so much. The texts explain that this obsession was driven by an impossible standard.
The Quran itself.
Right, Muslims believe that the Quran was the literal, uncreated, perfect word of God. So by definition, a human being could never write something that perfectly beautiful or impactful. It was literally impossible to emulate.
But instead of just giving up, that impossible standard drove them to prize human eloquence to the absolute highest degree.
Yeah. And the definition they use for eloquence is just incredible. They defined it as words reaching their meaning before traveling too long.
It's beautiful, isn't it? That phrase captures the aesthetic ideal of the era perfectly. Clarity, precision, impact. But, while adab was universally respected by everyone, the relationship between the two main spheres, the traditional and the rationale, was incredibly fraught. In fact, it was really the defining intellectual conflict of the era.
This is where the structural dynamic gets really interesting for me. Because when I was reading this part of the sources, I immediately mapped it onto the modern university campus.
Oh, really? How so?
It sounds exactly like the STEM versus humanities debate we have today, where different departments fight for funding and prestige and they kind of look down on each other. Except in this medieval context, the dynamic is completely flipped.
Flipped hat.
Well, the STEM subjects, the rational sciences like physics, math, and logic, were the ones viewed with deep suspicion. And the humanities, the traditional textual studies, the law and theology, they were the dominant, aggressive force on campus.
That is a very apt, if inverted, analogy. The traditionalists, the scholars of law and textual revelation, were highly protective of their domain. They viewed the rational sciences with intense suspicion, primarily because of their origin.
Because they came from the Greeks.
Exactly. As we noted, these fields were rooted in ancient Greek philosophy, think Aristotle, Ptolemy. The traditionalists argued, how can you trust a system of universal truth that was created by pagans entirely outside of the Islamic revelation?
And it wasn't just a polite disagreement at academic conferences over tea. The traditionalists saw the rational sciences, especially metaphysics, as a literal existential threat to the faith.
It was a very real fear.
Right, because if you start using Greek logic to prove or disprove the existence of God or the nature of the soul, you might logic your way right out of orthodox belief.
Precisely. And this anxiety manifested in concrete, aggressive actions. It wasn't just talk. Many of the wealthy endowments that funded the schools explicitly wrote into their founding documents that the rational sciences were permanently banned from being taught on the premises.
The sources cite a wild example of this escalation. There was this Ayyubid Sultan in Damascus. He didn't just ban the books. He actively purged the entire academic community.
Oh, it was a massive crackdown.
He commanded the scholars of the city to completely cease teaching anything except the traditional religious textual sciences. And then he literally expelled all the students who were caught studying the rational sciences. He just banished the STEM kids from the city entirely.
It was basically an intellectual Cold War that occasionally flared into open conflict like that. And even when it didn't end in expulsions, the rivalry defined the intellectual culture at the very highest levels of power.
Like in the royal courts.
Exactly. Take the court of Timur, the great conqueror, in the city of Samarkand. His court hosted this legendary, bitter rivalry between two intellectual heavyweights. You had Taftazani, who championed the traditional sciences, and Jurjani, who was the master of the rational sciences.
And they would just go head to head.
Yes. They held massive public debates in front of the ruler. And the favor of the court, which meant the funding and the prestige, would constantly shift back and forth depending on which side the reigning ruler preferred at any given moment.
Okay, so we have a clear picture of the curriculum. We see these fierce rivalries between the disciplines and the intense respect for the teachers with their giant turbans. But I'm kind of stuck on the actual logistics of this.
How so?
Like, how did a student actually learn this material day to day? Because they certainly weren't logging into an online portal to download a PDF syllabus, and they definitely weren't sitting in a 300-person lecture hall taking standardized multiple-choice tests.
No, not at all. And this is perhaps the most difficult paradigm shift for a modern listener to make when trying to understand this world, because our educational system today is fundamentally institutional.
Right, you go to a school, you get a degree from that school.
Exactly. You graduate from a university, and the brick-and-mortar institution grants you that degree. But in the Islamic Middle periods, education was fiercely, intimately personal.
So the school didn't matter.
The institution was largely irrelevant to your actual credentials. It was an informal, profound bond between one specific teacher and one specific student. When scholars later compiled biographical dictionaries to record the lives of great men, they rarely even bothered to mention where a person studied. The physical building didn't matter.
Wow, so what did they record?
They only meticulously recorded who the person studied with.
Right. The text refers to this bond as suba, which translates to companionship. And the physical manifestation of this companionship was the halqa, which means the study circle.
The halqa was everything.
And it sounds so informal. The teacher wouldn't stand at a podium in front of a whiteboard. They would just sit on the ground, often with their back leaning against a pillar in a mosque, or maybe just sitting in a local shop, or even out under a tree on a riverbank.
Just wherever they could gather.
Yeah, and the students would sit cross-legged in a semicircle around them. And the physical layout of the circle was actually a map of the academic hierarchy. As a student proved their intellectual worth over months or years, the teacher would invite them to physically move closer and sit nearer to them in the circle.
It's a great visual. The physical proximity was a direct reflection of intellectual and spiritual intimacy. And within that intimate circle, the mechanism of learning was almost entirely oral.
Okay, I have to stop and push back on this because it genuinely baffles me every time I read about it.
Go for it.
This is a society with a massive paper industry.
Right.
They have a thriving book trade and very high levels of literacy among the scholars. Written texts were everywhere. Why on earth would they rely on oral recitation and memorization?
It does seem counterintuitive to us.
It sounds agonizingly inefficient. If I want to learn the contents of a book today, I don't demand that the author sit down in front of me and read it aloud while I memorize it word for word. I just buy the paperback and read it in my room on my own time. Why wouldn't they just read the books?
To answer that, we have to look at how they philosophically understood the nature of truth and the nature of language itself. The great 14th century historian and philosopher Ibn Khaldun wrote extensively on this exact issue.
What was his take?
He argued that the physical written book is fundamentally flawed. He believed that handwriting and text place a veil between the representation of a word and its true intended meaning.
A veil. Like it hides the meaning. How so?
Well, Ibn Khaldun believed that written language is merely an imperfect interpretation of ideas that actually exist purely in the mind. When you read a silent text on a page, you are entirely separated from the imagination, the tone, and the context of the author.
I guess that's like when you read a text message and completely misunderstand the tone. Like, are they mad at me or just busy?
Exactly. That is a perfect modern equivalent. It's a dead transmission. To extract the living truth, the words must be animated by human breath. Truth resides in speech.
So the books were just tools, not the authority.
Right. Books were certainly produced and highly valued. We'll talk about the book trade later. But in the educational context, they were viewed strictly as aids memoir, just memory aids. The text on the page was considered dormant until it was spoken aloud by someone who truly understood it.
That is a beautiful, deeply poetic way to view language.
Okay.
But practically, it creates a massive logistical nightmare.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if the truth only lives in the spoken word of the author or the author's direct student, I can't just order a copy of a famous text from Cairo and read it in my house in Baghdad. I have to physically go find the person.
You do. And this strict requirement is what generated the primary mechanism of the entire educational network, the ijāza.
The ijāza, this is the core credential of this whole system, right? But it's not a diploma.
No, it is fundamentally different from a diploma. A diploma certifies that you completed a general course of study at an institution. Like, you passed enough classes to get a BA.
Right.
An ijāza is a highly specific personal license to transmit a single text. And you didn't earn it by passing a written exam. You earned it by sitting in that circle, memorizing the text, and then reciting it aloud flawlessly back to the teacher while simultaneously explaining its deepest meanings to their satisfaction.
So you have to prove you not only memorized it, but actually comprehend the nuance behind it.
Exactly. And once you achieved that, the teacher wrote you the ijāza, which physically documented your name, linked directly to their name, linked directly to their teacher's name, forming a verified chain of human transmitters going all the way back to the original author of the text.
It was a chain of living, verified nodes. It's almost like a human blockchain for knowledge.
That's actually a really good way to think about it. If you had the ijāza, you possessed personal authority over that text.
But as I pointed out, because this knowledge was locked inside specific human beings, it necessitated massive, grueling physical travel. You couldn't just stay in your hometown. This practice was known as the rila, the journey in search of knowledge.
And the scale of this travel is staggering. When you remember they were doing this on foot or by animal.
The sources highlight the itinerary of Ibn al-Arabi, the famous scholar and mystic. This guy traveled from Andalusia in Spain, all the way across North Africa, to Tunis, down to Fez, across the brutal deserts to Mecca, up to Baghdad, over to Damascus, and deep into Anatolia.
It's a mind-boggling distance.
And he wasn't traveling as a tourist, taking in the sights. He was traveling specifically to sit at the feet of specific masters in those exact cities to earn their ijazas.
The rila was grueling. You're traveling thousands of miles by caravan. You're facing bandits, disease, political instability, harsh weather. But it was viewed as the ultimate proof of a scholar's dedication.
And because this entire massive global system relied on human memory, the pressure on the students' brains must have been immense. Which actually brings us right back to our opening scenario with the poor student.
Ah, yes, the memory advice.
Right. The educational manuals of the time were packed with advice on how to optimize your memory. And some of it is very standard, good advice. Study early in the morning. Avoid eating heavy foods that make you lethargic.
Basic common sense stuff.
Yeah, but then the text lists things that supposedly actively destroy your memory. They warned students to strictly avoid eating fresh coriander. They said to avoid eating sour apples. And incredibly, they said to avoid beholding a man crucified, which just paints a remarkably grim picture of the medieval commute.
It's a jarring detail for sure, but it firmly grounds us in the historical reality of the urban environment they were navigating. Executions were public, and the psychological shock of witnessing one was genuinely believed to disrupt the delicate mental balance required for memorization.
It's just wild to think about. Okay, so we have this vast informal network of study circles, fueled by scholars walking thousands of miles across deserts to memorize texts to avoid the veil of the written word. But obviously a system that informal can't rely entirely on sitting by riverbanks forever. Eventually they needed physical infrastructure.
They did. As the centuries progressed, particularly starting in the 10th and 11th centuries, we see the rise of a new physical institution, the madrasa.
Now, madrasa in modern Arabic generally just means school, right? Like an elementary school. But historically, it had a much more specific definition.
Yes. Historically, a madrasa was explicitly a place to teach law. The early proliferation of madrasas is heavily associated with Nizam al-Mulk, who was the incredibly powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire. He established a network of them across Iraq and Iran.
And what do these early ones look like?
Initially, these were relatively straightforward buildings designed just to house students and provide a dedicated, quiet space for legal instruction.
But they didn't stay simple for long. The sources show that by the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, these buildings had mutated into these gargantuan, sprawling architectural marvels.
They really became the centerpieces of the cities.
They became educational charitable complexes. A single foundation in Cairo or Damascus might include the madrasa classrooms, a massive Friday mosque, a working hospital, an orphanage, an astronomical observatory, and the founder's grand mausoleum, all wrapped up into one colossal urban footprint.
It's like a small city within the city. And the sheer scale and expense of these complexes naturally raises a historical question for us. Why were the ruling elites pouring such astronomical sums of money into building them?
Right. What's the ROI on a massive school complex?
Well, for a long time, the dominant theory among historians was that the madrasa was essentially an instrument of state ideological control.
A brainwashing factory for the state.
Exactly. The idea was that the rulers, who were Orthodox Sunnis, built these massive institutions to manufacture a compliant class of bureaucrats and to enforce strict religious conformity, stamping out any dissenting or Shia thought.
It sounds like a plausible theory.
It does. But modern scholarship, driven by historians like Michael Chamberlain and Jonathan Berkey, has heavily dismantled that theory. They looked really closely at the daily operations of these madrasas and realized they were not functioning like corporate top-down universities.
Wait, really? With buildings that big, I assume they were highly structured.
Nope. No, there was no standardized institutional curriculum. The madrasa itself didn't even grant degrees. The core dynamic, that informal person-to-person suba we talked about, the individual teacher granting an ijāza to a specific student, that remained completely unchanged.
So the building didn't change the method.
Exactly. The madrasa was essentially just a very expensive, very beautiful container for the exact same informal study circles that used to meet in the shops and mosques.
Okay, wait, let's unpack this logic. If the state isn't actually controlling the curriculum and the institution isn't granting the degrees, then what is the point? Why is a ruthless military commander or a wealthy sultan spending an absolute fortune to build a colossal complex just so a bunch of independent scholars have a nice courtyard to sit in?
It all comes down to the intersection of medieval politics and economics. The first factor is the politics of display.
Displaying power.
Right. The military elites of this era, particularly the Mamluks in Egypt and Syria, were often of foreign slave origin. They didn't have deep roots in the local community, so they needed legitimacy in the eyes of the local populace.
And the scholars had that legitimacy.
Exactly. The Islamic scholars, the ulama, held the true social capital. By building a magnificent madrasa and placing their own grand tomb right in the center of it, these warlords and sultans were physically annexing the immense social prestige of Islamic scholarship. They were literally buying legitimacy.
They wanted their names permanently associated with piety, which, makes sense.
Right.
But that's just the PR angle. The sources reveal a second motive that is deeply, shockingly pragmatic, and it all revolves around the legal mechanism used to fund these buildings.
The waqf.
Yes, the waqf.
The waqf is the crucial engine of this entire architectural boom. A waqf is basically an inalienable charitable endowment under Islamic law. A wealthy individual takes a piece of income-producing property, say a vast tract of agricultural land or a busy commercial market or even a public bathhouse, and they legally dedicate the revenue from that property to fund a charitable cause in perpetuity.
Or they dedicate the profits to charity forever.
Right. In this case, funding the salaries of the madrasa teachers, the upkeep of the massive building, and stipends for the students.
Which sounds incredibly noble and pious. But there is a massive loophole in the waqf law that changes everything.
There is indeed a loophole.
Walk us through it.
The loophole is this. The founder of the waqf had the legal right to stipulate in the founding document exactly how the funds were distributed. But, more importantly, they could legally appoint themselves and their descendants as the permanent administrators of the endowment.
Okay, I see where this is going.
And they could stipulate that any surplus revenue generated by the endowment after the teachers and the upkeep were paid for would go directly into the pockets of the administrator.
I cannot get over how clever this is. Let's walk through a hypothetical to make sure I have this right and to really show how genius this was.
Okay, lay it out.
So imagine I am a powerful Mamluk warlord in Cairo. I have amassed a massive fortune through conquest and taxation. I am incredibly rich, but my position is precarious. The Sultan could turn on me tomorrow, execute me, and legally confiscate all of my wealth, leaving my family totally penniless.
A very common occurrence in that era.
Right. Or Even if I manage to die naturally in my bed, strict Islamic inheritance laws will chop my fortune up into tiny pieces among all my distant relatives, so my main heir doesn't get much. So to protect my money, I create a whack. I take my massive fortune, I build a beautiful madrasa, and I endow it with the revenue from 3 massive commercial markets that I own.
And legally, once you do that, you no longer own those markets. They belong to God.
Which means the Sultan cannot confiscate them, and inheritance laws do not apply to them.
Right. The wealth is sheltered.
And then the paperwork, I write that my eldest son and his eldest son will forever be the administrators of this charity, and they get to keep the surplus profits. It's brilliant.
Building a madrasa wasn't just an act of devotion. It was the medieval equivalent of setting up an offshore, tax-sheltered family foundation.
It really was. You get the great public relations, you get a giant monument with your name on it, you protect your wealth from the government, and your descendants get a cushy, guaranteed income stream forever.
It's honestly a masterclass in wealth preservation. It was a remarkably sophisticated strategy, and the historical record proves that piety was frequently entirely secondary to family financial planning. The sources highlight several glaring examples of skewed priorities within these WAF documents.
Oh, like what?
For instance, in one prominent madrasa, the founding document strictly stipulated that the preachers, the Quran readers, the porters, and even the cleaners had to receive their salaries before the teachers and the students got a single coin.
Wait, the janitors got paid before the professors.
Exactly. Because the family administration wanted to control the hierarchy. And in another astonishing case, the WAC document for a so-called educational foundation failed to mention provisions for teachers or students entirely.
They just forgot to include the school part of the school.
Exactly. It was a naked legal fiction to shelter assets.
That is utterly fascinating. But it raises a geographical question. We've been talking a lot about the heartlands, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, where wealthy individuals were using this WAF loophole to build independent power bases. But this system of ilm was global.
It stretched across continents.
So how did this work at the frontiers or under massive, highly centralized empires? Because if I am the Ottoman Sultan ruling from Istanbul, I am not going to tolerate thousands of independent warlords setting up tax shelters and letting scholars teach whatever they want. I need control.
And the Ottomans recognized that exactly. As we shift to look at global adaptations, the Ottoman Empire provides the starkest contrast to the informal, decentralized system of the Arab heartlands we just talked about.
What did they do differently?
The Ottomans took the concept of the madrasa and completely bureaucratized it. They transformed it into a rigid imperial machine.
How rigid are we talking?
Extremely. They created a strict, graded hierarchy of institutions. At the bottom, you had the exterior madrasas, which focused on preparatory work and foundational texts. If a student excelled there, they could test into the interior madrasas, which dealt with the heavier traditional sciences.
It's starting to sound a lot more like a modern school system.
It is. And at the very absolute apex of this pyramid were the seminai, the elite imperial madrasas established by the great sultans themselves, like Mehmed the Conqueror and Suleiman the Magnificent in Istanbul.
So you couldn't just wander from riverbank to riverbank collecting ijazas anymore. You had to actually climb the ladder.
You had to climb the ladder, and you had to pass through these grades in strict sequential order. And the goal wasn't just pure independent scholarship. This was the official pipeline for the imperial civil service.
Ah, so this is how you got a government job.
Exactly. If you wanted to be a judge, a provincial governor, or a high-ranking bureaucrat in the Ottoman state, you had to graduate from this system. The state controlled the syllabus, and the state controlled the careers of the graduates.
But the Ottomans had another educational system running parallel to the madrasas that is even more astonishing to me. And it wasn't for freeborn Muslims. It was for slaves. The sources touch on this, and it's a concept that requires a lot of context because it completely defies our modern understanding of slavery. Several major Islamic empires, the Mamluks in Egypt, the Safavids in Iran, and the Ottomans, relied heavily on and were sometimes literally ruled by highly educated military slaves.
It is a paradox that is very difficult for modern audiences to grasp. Slavery in this context was not plantation chattel slavery. It was an extreme form of statecraft and military recruitment.
How did it work in the Ottoman context?
The most fully realized example of this was the Ottoman palace school known as the Enderun. The system began with the devshirme, which was the infamous blood tax. The Ottoman state would periodically send recruiters into their Christian European territories, like the Balkans, Greece, and legally conscript a percentage of the young Christian boys from the villages.
Which is horrifying on a human level. Just taking children from their families.
It was undeniably traumatic. These boys were taken, legally converted to Islam, and then subjected to an incredibly rigorous process of testing and sorting. They were evaluated for their physical strength, their stamina, their appearance, and crucially, their intellect.
And this sorting determined your entire life path. The boys who were incredibly strong but perhaps didn't have the highest academic aptitude were sent to the Janissary Corps, right? The elite, highly disciplined shock infantry of the Ottoman army.
Right. They became the military backbone of the empire.
But the absolute brightest, the most intellectually gifted boys were diverted away from the infantry and sent to the palace school, the Enderun, right inside the Topkapi Palace.
And the curriculum they faced at the Enderun was arguably one of the most intense educational programs in human history. It was designed to completely sever their past identities and rebuild them into perfect instruments of the state.
What were they learning?
They underwent deep immersion in languages, mastering Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They studied mathematics, advanced literature, and complex Islamic law. But intellectual rigor was only half of it. They were simultaneously subjected to punishing physical and martial training. They mastered archery, wrestling, horsemanship, and military tactics.
It's like a hyper-intense, lethal boarding school, like a real-world Hogwarts mixed with a Spartan military academy.
That's a very colorful way to put it, but accurate. The goal wasn't to make them scholars who debate theology in a courtyard. The goal was to forge a class of elite warrior statesmen.
Guys who could do it all.
Yes. Men who could command an army in the field, negotiate a complex treaty in 3 languages, and administer a massive province with flawless legal precision. And crucially, because they had been taken from their families and were legally owned by the Sultan, they had no local aristocratic ties. Their loyalty was engineered to be absolute.
Because they owed everything to the Sultan.
Exactly. Historians frequently draw a parallel between the Enderun system and the political philosophy of ancient Greece. It is arguably the closest any society has ever come to realizing the ideal outlined in Plato's Republic, the deliberate, meticulous creation of a class of philosopher kings, or in this case, philosopher administrators.
It's a breathtaking social experiment. But let's leave the empires of Istanbul and Cairo for a minute, because the network of ʿIlm reached far beyond the Mediterranean. I want to shift our focus to the vast expanses of West Africa, specifically to the city of Timbuktu.
It is essential that we do. Today, the name Timbuktu is sometimes used colloquially in the West as a punchline, a shorthand for the absolute end of the earth, the middle of nowhere.
Like, oh, I had to drive all the way to Timbuktu.
Right. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, Timbuktu was the exact opposite. It was a thriving cosmopolitan metropolis, heavily integrated into the trans-Saharan trade routes, and it was the absolute intellectual center of gravity for the entire region.
The wealth flowing through Timbuktu was legendary gold, salt, textiles. But the sources highlight a detail that just blew me away. In this massive lucrative market, the single most valuable items of trade, the commodities that fetched the absolute highest prices, were books.
The book trade in Timbuktu was king. The appetite for texts, legal treatises, poetry, astronomy, theology was completely insatiable. And satisfying that appetite required monumental logistical effort.
Because you can't just print them locally.
No, you had to bring them in. The sources mention the Shinkiti people, who were scholars from the region of modern-day Mauritania. They essentially function as the intellectual couriers of the Sahara.
What did they do?
These individuals would mount massive expeditions, traveling from the academic centers of Fez in Morocco all the way across North Africa to the Hijaz in Arabia, Mecca, and Medina. They would scour the markets and libraries, hunting for rare manuscripts, purchase them, and then haul entire caravan loads of heavy, fragile texts back across the brutal expanse of the Sahara Desert to supply the scholars of West Africa.
The sheer physical dedication required to move a library across the Sahara on camelback is unbelievable. I mean, you have to protect the parchment from the sand, the extreme heat, the potential for bandits and raids.
It was a massive undertaking.
And the legacy of that effort is still physically present today. The sources estimate that there are roughly 300,000 manuscripts still existing in and around Timbuktu today, surviving centuries of empires rising and falling.
This dedication to the material preservation of knowledge created breathtaking private libraries. The text explicitly highlights the Mahmud Kadi Library, an ancient collection in Timbuktu that still contains nearly 3,000 volumes.
That is an incredible archive.
It is. Modern historians have described the preservation and cataloging of this library as the find of the century for African history. It provides irrefutable, massive documentary evidence that the intense intellectual rigor and manuscript culture of the Islamic world was not confined to the Arab heartlands or the Ottoman capital. It was thriving, adapting, and expanding on the edges of the Sahara.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the immense egos of Mamluk scholars, the ruthless bureaucratic machine of the Ottoman Palace School, the trans-Saharan book caravans. But stepping back, this entire landscape feels profoundly, exclusively male.
It often does in the traditional tellings.
Right. It's sultans, male scholars, warrior slaves, and male couriers. We're women completely locked out of this pursuit of ilm.
It is an incredibly important question, and it addresses a massive blind spot in popular historical perception. The short answer is no, they were not locked out. Despite living under severe social, legal, and patriarchal restrictions, women were deeply, actively, and significantly involved in the world of ilm.
How do they justify that involvement?
Well, the mandate that we discussed at the very beginning, that seeking knowledge is a duty, was taken incredibly seriously by women. In fact, manuscript copyists of the era often took it upon themselves to amend the written text of that famous hadith we mentioned.
Wait, they altered the text?
Yes. Where the original simply said seeking knowledge is the duty of every Muslim, copyists explicitly added the phrase wa muslima, meaning and every Muslim woman, just to ensure there was absolutely no ambiguity about the mandate applying to them.
They literally wrote women into the margins to make sure they weren't forgotten. That is amazing. And women with wealth exerted massive influence through patronage, right? We talked earlier about the walk system and those massive madrasa complexes. Women were major funders of these institutions.
Their financial power was undeniable. The sources note that in Safavid Isfahan, which was a major cultural capital in Iran, out of the 13 major religious buildings endowed by women, 6 of them were specifically madrasas.
But they weren't simply writing checks from behind closed doors, right? Many women were formidable scholars in their own right. The challenge they faced was navigating the physical and social spaces of a highly segregated society.
That was the primary hurdle.
Right, because if the madrasa was the physical center of learning, were women allowed in the classrooms?
Generally, no. Women were largely excluded from formally teaching or attending classes inside the physical madrasa buildings. The patriarchal rationale, which is explicitly stated in some of the sources, was the fear that the physical presence of women would put the male students off their studies.
Classic excuse. So if they are physically barred from the primary institutions, how did they pull off this level of scholarship? Because we know there were hundreds of highly educated women.
They bypassed the formal institutions entirely and utilized alternative spaces. The pursuit of ilm simply shifted to private homes and to the khanqahs, which were the Sufi lodges.
Okay, so it moved out of the public eye.
Right. Scholarly families played a massive role. A learned father or grandfather would extensively educate his daughters within the home, and then those learned women would teach other women. The sources document that in Fatimid Cairo, there were at least 5 major Sufi lodges explicitly dedicated to women teaching other women.
But their influence wasn't just limited to teaching other women. This is the detail I found most ironic and fascinating in the reading. Despite being shut out of the public madrasas, some of the most famous, authoritative male scholars in Islamic history, giants of the field like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and al-Suyuti, heavily relied on the authority of female scholars.
They absolutely did, particularly in the science of hadith transmission. The authenticity of the chain is everything, as we discussed. And many women held incredibly prestigious, verified ijāzas for crucial texts.
So these famous men had to go to them.
Yes. So you have these towering male figures of Islamic law, the men who were writing the definitive books of the era, who were forced to travel and sit at the feet of women in their private living rooms to request an ijāza from them. The men needed the women to validate their own credentials.
It's a brilliant subversion of the system. But my absolute favorite story of female scholarship in this entire deep dive isn't from Cairo or Damascus. It's the story of Nana Asma'u in 19th century Nigeria.
Oh, her story is phenomenal.
She was the daughter of Usman Danfodio, the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate. And her story isn't just about personal brilliance. It's about unparalleled logistical genius for mass grassroots education.
Nana Asma'u is a towering figure. She faced a monumental challenge. The Sokoto Caliphate was vast, covering a massive, dispersed rural territory. The population was newly incorporated, and she realized that the stability of the state required the rural populace, specifically the women, to deeply understand the tenets of Islamic law and theology.
But she couldn't possibly travel to every village, and rural women couldn't travel to the capital.
Exactly. So she builds a decentralized network. She creates an organization called the Yan Taru, which translates to the Associates.
How did that work?
She brings together groups of mature, intelligent women from the capital. She trains them intensely. She gives them her personal authority and ijāza, and then she deploys them out into the vast rural hinterlands as emissaries.
And the method they used to gather the people in these rural villages is just amazing. They didn't just post flyers. They were led by choral singers.
Yes, the use of poetry and song was a masterful pedagogical tool. Asma'u herself was a prolific poet, writing in Arabic, Fula, and Hausa. She wrote didactic poetry poems designed to teach theology, law, and history.
Catchy educational songs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The choral singers would enter a village singing these incredibly catchy, memorable poems. The spectacle would draw the entire village out.
It's essentially a 19th century flash mob used for mass education.
That's a great comparison.
The singers draw the crowd, the emissaries gather up the young girls and the older women of the village, and they physically bring them back to Sokoto. There, Asma'u would directly teach them the essentials of the faith. And then, the brilliant final step. Those newly educated rural women would return to their own villages and become the teachers for their communities.
It was a self-replicating, viral network of female education. It was a highly effective system that deeply rooted the caliphate's ideology in the countryside. And Nana Asma'u represents the practical, applied side of female scholarship. But we also have examples of women engaging in the highest levels of theoretical debate.
Like who?
The sources mention Bija Munajjima, a 16th century Iranian woman. As her name, Munajjima, suggests, she was an expert astronomer and astrologer. She commanded advanced mathematics and actively, publicly rivaled and debated famous male scholars of her time, including the prominent poet and intellectual Jami.
But of course, a woman publicly debating men in advanced mathematics is going to trigger a reaction.
It triggered intense, often vitriolic, misogynistic pushback. The patriarchal establishment was deeply threatened by this intellectual mobility.
How bad was the pushback?
The text provides a chilling example, quoting a Mamluk market inspector's manual. These manuals were designed to regulate public behavior. This specific manual explicitly warned against educating women, claiming that a woman who learns to write is like a snake given poison to drink.
A snake given poison to drink. That is incredibly aggressive. They were genuinely terrified of what would happen if women had full access to the written word.
They recognized that literacy is power. But despite this intense hostility, the sheer volume of evidence proves that women consistently subverted these restrictions. When the scholar al-Sakhawi compiled a biographical dictionary of the luminaries of his century, he listed 411 educated women. From the female poets of Timurid Iran to the hadith masters of Cairo, women carved out vital spaces within the world of ʿIlm.
Okay, so we've mapped out the elites, the scholars in their turbans, the warrior slaves in the palace, the brilliant women organizing rural networks. But I want to zoom out to the ground level for a bit. What about the average person on the street? The people who aren't writing books or debating theology? What are the kids? How did the massive base of this societal pyramid engage with all of this knowledge?
Let's start with the children. The educational journey for a child typically began at what the texts call the age of discernment, which was usually around 6 or 7 years old.
Where did they go?
They would attend the kutab, which was the elementary school. The great theologian al-Ghazali wrote extensively on childhood education. He argued that learning at this specific age is like engraving a stone.
Meaning the mind is permanent, impressionable, and whatever you carve into it will last a lifetime. So what were they carving?
The primary focus at the kutab was rote memorization of the Quran. Alongside that, there was a heavy emphasis on basic character training, manners, and proper Islamic behavior.
Interestingly, though, Ghazali wasn't just a strict disciplinarian. I found this part surprising. He actually explicitly advocated for playtime, which feels very modern.
It does.
He argued that if you force a child to constantly study without giving them time to play, you will break their spirit and make them despise learning altogether. However, despite Ghazali's enlightened views on recess, the reality of the kutab was often quite harsh.
Yes. The sources note that corporal punishment was a major, enduring issue. It was unfortunately very prevalent. The use of the cane was so widespread and often so severe that it required state intervention.
How did the state intervene?
We mentioned earlier the mutasibs, the market inspectors who regulated commerce and public morals. Part of their official duties actually included physically inspecting the elementary schools to ensure that the teachers were not brutally harming the children.
And because kids are kids, this shared trauma of the kutab created a universal cultural touchstone. The text points out a hilarious detail about the popular literature of the time.
Ah, the Amir Hamza story.
Yes, there was a massively famous fictional adventure epic called The Adventures of Amir Hamza, which was beloved all over the Asian Muslim world. It's full of battles and magic. But one of the most crowd-pleasing, universally beloved episodes in the entire massive epic is a scene where the hero Hamza and his sidekick brutally exact revenge on their terrible, abusive childhood teacher, the mullah.
It was pure cathartic wish fulfillment for every single adult who ever had to sit through a beating in a medieval elementary school. It provided a very necessary psychological release valve for the culture.
I love that. But beyond the children, how did the adult masses engage with ilm? Because a farmer or a blacksmith doesn't have the time or the literacy to sit in a study circle for 10 years.
Right. For the masses, engagement happened primarily in the public square. This occurred through mass, public recitations of the Hadith during holy months, which were highly attended civic events. But the most prominent and controversial avenue for popular education was the street storyteller, the Klaus.
The storytellers, I find these guys endlessly fascinating because they are essentially the medieval equivalent of shock jocks or sensationalist pulp preachers.
They really were.
They didn't operate in the quiet courtyards of the madrasas. They stood on street corners, in the bazaars, outside the mosques, and they drew staggering crowds. The sources claim that one famous storyteller in 11th century Baghdad regularly drew audiences of nearly 30,000 people.
Their reach was phenomenal. They were entertainers as much as they were educators. They would recount thrilling tales of early Islamic heroes, vivid descriptions of heaven and hell, and they would stir up incredible emotional fervor, driving the crowds to tears and passionate prayers.
But their massive popularity created a massive problem because the verified elite scholars, the guys with the actual ijāzas, absolutely despised them.
They really did. And this brings us to a crucial tension regarding authority. The elite ulama distrusted the storytellers deeply because the storytellers prioritized emotional impact over factual, rigorous transmission.
They just wanted the crowd to pop.
Exactly. To keep the crowd engaged, a storyteller would frequently invent details, exaggerate narratives, and most dangerously, utilize spurious, completely fake hadiths.
They were spreading medieval fake news to get a bigger reaction from the crowd. And because they didn't have an ijāza, they existed outside the verified chain of transmission. They were rogue nodes in the network, spreading unauthorized, emotionally volatile data.
And the scholars viewed this as a genuine threat to the integrity of the faith. It occasionally resulted in actual physical danger.
Oh, like a riot.
Yes. The sources relate an incredible incident involving the famous, highly respected scholar Al-Suyuti. Al-Suyuti was so outraged by the proliferation of fake hadiths that he formally issued a fatwa, a binding legal ruling condemning a very popular local storyteller.
And the storyteller's fans did not take it well.
Not at all.
The text says the storyteller's audience became so enraged by this academic condemning their favorite entertainer that they formed a mob and nearly stoned Al-Suyuti to death. The populist fan base almost murdered one of the greatest legal minds of the century.
It perfectly encapsulates the volatile, sometimes violent dynamic between elite, verified knowledge and raw, populist religious fervor.
It really does. Now, speaking of intense emotion and fervor, we must address the final and perhaps most profound dimension of education mentioned in our sources. The mystics, the Sufis.
This is a totally different paradigm. We've talked about the rational sciences using logic, and the traditional sciences focusing on the law. But the Sufis were focused on spiritual education, known as tasawwuf.
How is it different?
Well, the jurist asked, what is the law of God? A Sufi asked, how can I intimately know the presence of God in my heart? The educational dynamic here was fundamentally different. It was no longer merely a teacher and a student. It was the intense, absolute bond between a master, the sheikh, and a disciple, the murid.
The text described this relationship with such beautiful imagery. They don't talk about memorizing books. They describe the spiritual state flowing directly from the master into the disciple like one lamp lighting another.
But achieving that illumination required a grueling psychological and physical process.
What kind of process?
The primary obstacle to knowing God in Sufi thought is the human ego, the illusion of the self. Before a disciple could receive advanced spiritual training, the master had to crush their ego to ensure they were completely devoted and empty of pride.
It was spiritual boot camp, and the methods were intentionally humiliating. The sources state that it was a favored practice for a master to force a new disciple to clean the communal latrines of the lodge for 3 solid years before they were even allowed to enter the master's inner circle.
3 years of manual labor.
3 years of cleaning toilets just to prove you didn't think you were special.
The goal of this extreme discipline was to guide the disciple through specific stages of spiritual development. It began with profound repentance, moved through absolute, unwavering trust in God, blossomed into divine love, and culminated in the ultimate goal, fana.
Fauna.
Annihilation. Yes, the complete annihilation of the self. It is the psychological state where the disciple's individual ego entirely dissolves into the overwhelming presence of the divine.
That sounds intense.
It is. To reach this state required absolute submission to the guidance of the sheikh. The disciple had to be like a corpse in the hands of the washer. The devotion this inspired was total and often defied all logical sense.
There is a story that perfectly illustrates the extreme nature of this devotion. The text mentions a Chishti Sufi living in 14th century India. He receives a summons and has to travel from the city of Daulatabad to the city of Delhi. But his master is remaining behind in Daulatabad.
And he can't bear to disrespect him.
Right. Out of pure, unadulterated respect, this disciple refuses to turn his back on his master.
Yeah.
So he mounts his horse, faces backward, and rides the entire journey to Delhi, a journey of hundreds of miles facing the wrong way on his horse, just so his back is never turned toward his sheikh.
It is an extreme, almost comical image, but it perfectly underscores the central unifying theme of this entire historical era.
Which is what?
Whether we are looking at a jurist memorizing legal text, a warrior slave training in the palace, or a mystic riding backward on a horse, the core truth remains the same. Knowledge was entirely inextricably bound to the human being who carried it.
So what does this all mean for us? We've journeyed through a massive amount of history today. We've traveled from the libraries of Spain across the Sahara to Timbuktu. We've examined the tax-sheltered wealth of the grand madrasas, the living rooms of female scholars, the bitter debates over Greek logic, and the street corners of the storytellers.
It's a vast tapestry.
When you pull all these threads together, it paints a picture of a phenomenal world system. Long before European capitalism mapped the globe, long before the internet provided a digital infrastructure, it was the shared pursuit of ʿIlm, the unifying force of the Arabic language, and the physical, grueling travel required to secure that human-to-human ijāza that functioned as the connective tissue of the world.
It tied together vast, disparate cultures into a single, cohesive, intellectual universe. It was a monumental achievement of human networking.
It really was.
And if we connect this all the way back to where we started this conversation, your image of the modern person sitting in front of a screen, overwhelmed by a dozen open browser tabs. This history offers a profound challenge to our modern assumptions about what it actually means to learn.
Because the mechanics are entirely opposite now.
Precisely. Today, we consume knowledge largely in isolation. We stare at glowing screens, we download PDFs, we scroll endlessly through fragmented feeds. The information we consume is utterly divorced from any human connection.
It's just data on a server.
Right. But in the Islamic Middle periods, the knowledge was the connection. You could not possess the text without intimately knowing the teacher. The medium was the human being.
It's the profound difference between merely accumulating data and entering into a lineage.
And that contrast leaves us with a final necessary thought to mull over. Today, a single person with a smartphone has more information at their fingertips in 1 hour than a great globe-trotting scholar like Ibn al-Arabi or al-Ghazali had access to in their entire brilliant lifetimes.
It's true. We have everything.
We do. But by removing the suba, by eliminating that deeply human companionship, the physical struggle of the journey, the profound ego-crushing reverence for the teacher, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question. In our modern, relentless obsession with acquiring information as quickly and efficiently as possible, have we completely forgotten how to actually be wise?